Good afternoon. My apologies for not being with you here in person today, but my wife's due date for our second child is June 22nd, and I just could not risk missing that and being on hand to help. I hope you'll forgive me for my virtual presence at the moment and my Skype presence in just a few minutes. As Deborah has mentioned, I have been working for some time on the Musical Festival Database, a fully searchable index of programs, personnel, ensembles, and venues of musical festivals held in Great Britain between 1695 and 1940. I am currently writing a history of these festivals to be published sometime in the future by Boydell and Brewer. I've been working on this project for some time. My initial collection of the data for the festivals began when I was working on my dissertation in the 1990s. Over the past few years, with the possibility for big data analysis growing, I've turned to work on this project almost exclusively. Festivals were one of the most important means of concert music production in Great Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. Through such festivals, the middle classes ultimately became arbiters of musical taste, and festival infrastructure was largely responsible for the growth of an internationally recognized group of indigenous composers, including Edward Elgar, Ralph Vaughan Williams, Gustav Holst, and Benjamin Britten. Musical festivals introduced individuals outside of London to music by contemporary composers, both foreign and domestic, and shaped the genres desired and celebrated by the British, which largely included choral genres such as oratorios and cantatas. The festival helped shift the musician from a servant class, regarded as morally suspect because of his or her associations with the decadent aristocratic genres such as opera, to a respectable middle-class professional. And as most festivals raised money for a particular cause, including local hospitals and funds for widows and orphans, the charitable associations of festivals encouraged the British to stop thinking of music as a pleasurable pastime, viewing it instead as a didactic and edifying force. Consequently, investigating the British Musical Festival between 1695 and 1940 is a study not just of infrastructure or genre or individual composers and musicians, but a holistic view of the change of beliefs about the importance and place of musical culture in British society. From 1695 to 1940, this inquiry also allows us to see how the perception of who controlled musical taste in society shifted, from the aristocracy in 1695 to that controlled by the expanding middle classes in the early 19th century, and finally the professional musical classes by the end of the 19th century. When I decided to work on festivals, I first began to examine their programs in depth. This is a larger task than it might seem, since between 1695 and 1940, there are approximately 1,500 musical festivals presented in Great Britain in more than 40 cities, towns, and villages from Aberdeen to York. Over the past few decades, I have collected programs for hundreds of them. Many of these programs contain a wealth of information: the compositions performed, the names of the solo singers and instrumentalists, the identities of the conductors, as well as instrumental ensemble and choral forces used. For musicologists and social historians, this information is invaluable. It allows one to see, for instance, the creation of the musical canon that we know today, but more importantly, it shows just how malleable that canon has always been. If properly organized and readily available, one could use festival programs to help partially trace the importance or exposure of a particular composer, conductor, or soloist, as well as seeing myriad possibilities of how performances occurred throughout the period. Unfortunately, this information is largely scattered throughout individual archives in the United Kingdom. As of yet, there has been no attempt to systematically catalog and make available this rich source of information on musical tastes. Most studies of British musical festivals present the reader with limited sample programs, but offer too little information for more than a cursory comparison. And the various digitization projects about concert ephemera, also available, similarly present samples rather than whole and complete looks. For instance, the collection of festival programs of Sir George Smart, digitized by the British Library for the Gale Cengage 19th Century Collections online, includes about a dozen from Norwich, Cambridge, Hull, and Bath. Smart conducted these festivals between 1820 and 1840. We know that through newspaper reports that at this time he was listed as the conductor for more than 24 festivals during a period when there were about 100 given throughout Great Britain. So, at least for my own purposes, there was a need to gather this information together and make it easily available, to try and use it to activate a deeper understanding of festivals and taste and canon, at least for my own work. After a discussion with the programmer Chris Borgmeyer of Crooked River Designs, he and I decided to create the Musical Festivals Database as a bespoke relational database of British festival programs. Some startup funding was given by various agencies at Oberlin College, including the Conservatory Dean's Office and the Research and Development Office, and then the Ohio 5 colleges awarded a larger 2-year grant for digital collections based on Mellon Foundation funding. At the present moment, about 3 years into the conception of the database and a year into the Ohio 5 funding, we have limited amounts of information up for about 300 festivals, and a good deal of information up for about 60 of those festivals, including lists of complete programs, personnel, venues, and sources consulted to collate the data. The availability of this data has led to some interesting curricular offshoots. This past semester, I employed the Musical Festivals Database as a resource in my Music in the Romantic Era Intermediate Survey course. Students used the database to identify performers and repertoire, and then applied this information to create a recital. With the recital designed, they also created an annotated program for it, including a performer biography, a discussion of the pieces programmed, and a brief contextual discussion of the project. The assignment helps students view music in the 19th century from beyond the usual positivistic history of style and composers' biographies, and turned it into a more comprehensive view of the music that occurred in the 19th century. It also allowed them to see how much more diverse music in the 19th century was than what their textbooks and reference books tell them. For instance, many 19th century music textbooks concentrate almost exclusively on male composers. Most students chose to study female performers like Jenny Lind, Annalena Patti, or Clara Butt. Such students were able to see how frequently these women put their own compositions into programs, which have been mostly forgotten today, as well as able to see how much of the singer's repertoire was based on older pieces, and even how concerts at the end of the 19th century expanded their temporal reach backwards. Of course, progress from scholarly idea to classroom pedagogical tool has not always been smooth. There are hundreds of pieces of information for the most detailed programs, which takes a great deal of time to enter into the database. And festival data is uneven in availability and representation. For instance, just one festival in York in 1823 has a 436-page history, including minute detail, which has helped to generate thousands of searchable variables. But for many festivals in the 18th century, we frequently cannot find anything more than a short report in a newspaper, which gives us perhaps a dozen different variables. But one thing is clear: expanding the database beyond my own initial scholarly needs to pedagogical ones has made it into a much more useful tool, and is also helping me drive my own teaching and research strategies and priorities. Thank you.